So, doing a good job maintaining, you've tuned what you've got so it's the best it can be. For whatever reason, it's time to make a step change. It's time to do some retrofitting. So what's to be had? And remember the life cycle approach. You've got components, not a homogeneous system. You've got a renewed asset at the end of a retrofit. So you've got a brand new chiller, which should last for 20 years. You've got brand new air distribution. You've got a building which is tuned and running sweet. You've got happy tenants. You've got a renewed asset as such. Renewed assets these days come with extended warranties. They come with reduced maintenance costs. There's a whole range of other benefits that you can actually factor into your decision-making process. It's not just about spending the money, it's about what you get back at the other end. You end up with improved building performance in terms of star ratings, in terms of cost, and a whole range of other things. That step change improvement in energy efficiency. And also you can deal with things along the way like refrigerant change out and what have you, and other technology issues that you have. So what are the key issues in all of this? Triggers. What triggers the thing? What scope? How far do you go? How far do you go is a really interesting question that challenges people. Who are the stakeholders in all this? What are the technical challenges? Technical challenges that you need to be aware of as an owner or a manager. What are the delivery options? How do I get this crew together to do this? What's the best way forward in all of that? And how do I manage all that? What sort of challenges am I going to have in my day in managing this thing? It's a bit like the horror stories that we all sit around, of a Saturday evening with our friends talking about when I renovated the house. I had to live with builders for 2 years. Very similar thing in buildings around retrofits. That image is a building in George Street in Sydney. Retrofit we did about 3 years ago. New chiller going up the outside of a 50-storey building. It was actually done in an energy performance contract framework, which I'll talk about in a moment. But some pretty impressive sights when you see these things that weigh 5, 6, 7 tonne being dragged up the outside of a building. That's what's involved with those sorts of things sometimes. Quite often major HVAC retrofits get triggered by things other than major HVAC issues. They get triggered by a repositioning of the building, a vacancy opportunity, a change in ownership, a whole range of different things. Sometimes they get triggered by the asset condition. The chillers are now 25 years old and they will start to fail, or they failed twice last summer. We've got to do something about that. Sometimes it's triggered by energy. 1200 Buildings program has put together a retrofit survey. It makes interesting reading. I think there's a copy up there. It gives you a bit of an idea about why people make decisions about retrofits, what they do, and who they were and how they go about the things. So there's some instructive reading in that as such. The scope's an interesting decision. How far do you go? It can be essential plant only. It can be a whole range of other things in terms of air movement, water movement, controls, how far you go with controls. Tuning is an important part of a retrofit because once you put new plant in, you really need to tune it. You've got to make sure that all those new instruments are working in concert as such. There's also economies of scale in the thing as well. Well, whilst we've got people in the building doing this, there's a real opportunity to do this, this and this, and it'll be cheaper than coming back and doing it in 4 years' time. So there's a whole range of things to consider around how far you go and the scope. At the end of the day, it comes back to the objective that you're looking to achieve, what the trigger is, if you like. A big issue around a lot of these things for non-technical people, again, as I mentioned before, is veracity. How far do you go? There's no substitute for being informed, educated consumer, having some understanding of technical services. There's a lot of tools in the market. This is a tool that we've used a lot in the past, more as a visualisation decision-making tool. But you can actually go back and say, well, gee, if we put that boiler in, this is the commercial arrangement around all of that in terms of payback. This is the portion of a star that it'll offer up compared to, say, a less efficient boiler. And you can start to wrinkle those things and you can cut it a lot of different ways. You can see it goes back to a time when black balloons were in vogue, which interestingly they are no longer. So people will use different tools. As I said a number of times, there's no dumb questions, only dumb answers. They should be willing to and able to explain the rationale behind what they're suggesting to you. Talked before about stakeholders in a retrofit. And again, retrofits can be all back a house, or they could be something like a 500 Collins or a 500 Burke, which is 3 or 4 floors at the time, total change out of HVAC system, all those sorts of things. So the owner wants a green outcome, wants it on time, wants it on budget, doesn't want tenants to be interrupted at all. The tenant doesn't want to see any issues really, but happy to accommodate some if well communicated with, but pretty much no disruption, inconvenience. I've got a business to run, don't muck me around, I'm paying for the space. The head contractor or the builder wants to deliver a project on time, on budget, and has got a site approach. It's my construction site, and I'll do with it as I wish. The facilities manager is, as somebody explained to me once, is piggy in the middle. Tenant complaints, builder issues, access issues. The builder thinks it's their site, the facilities manager thinks it's their site, the tenant thinks it's their home, and the facilities manager's in the middle. Used to usually controlling the site and all the works on the site. So somebody's come into my lounge room and is changing things. Doesn't want any tenant complaints because it's a primary driver. And wants to see ageing plan updated and their life made easier. The HVAC maintainer has got a contract to come in and do certain things at certain times and be responsive in a certain way. And the whole place is disrupted, so it compromises their ability to do the job and costs them money. And they're a bit nervous about all this new equipment and what's it all going to mean and what have you. And of course the HVAC installer in a retrofit, again a bit like the builder, wants to come in and get the job done and make it all happen. So there's issues of understanding, there's issues of control, and there's issues of demarcation in lots of ways. Again, forewarned is forearmed, I suppose, when you start to think about a retrofit, not just in a blithe, let's do something about it way, but in a people management way. Communications at the end of the day is the key to all this. Communications that are planned, communications that are responsive, and communications that engage people solve a lot of these issues. On the technical side of things, not so much from a contractor perspective, but from a building ownership management perspective, what are some of the technical challenges that people will see on the way through? Quite often you're trying to marry up to existing equipment. What state's it in? How do you test that when it's running? Quite often consultants and others will call on new technologies, and how's all it going to work in an old building? Lots of issues around that. Airtightness might not be an issue in a building like this because the air conditioning copes with it, but with some of the new air conditioning approaches, you've got to have a very airtight box, and you need to test that before you actually go ahead and do those sorts of things. Maintaining that mechanical plant. Mechanical plant typically will run a number of floors, so how do you shut off 3 floors while you're doing work on them? All a bit challenging around that. You end up with a staged handover process quite often in a retrofit thing too. You just don't finish one day and everybody walks off and it's all tickety-boo. It might be 7 or 8 stages of handover. So how do you manage all of that as well? It becomes quite complex. Commissioning and tuning is a part of that as well in terms of stage commissioning, stage tuning. How do you actually get to a point where you can commission and tune everything along the way? There are issues with electricity in terms of power supply and power outages and shutting things down. Not everything can be done out of hours. Quite often you'll go into a building that's anything that's older than 5 minutes and there'll be issues about tenant power and base building power and what have you, and the electrician pulled the fuse out of something and said, oh, I thought that just powered that, and half the building goes down. I'm in the data centre on level 34. So there's all sorts of issues around all of that. Running 2 building control systems at the same time, so having 2 brains and 2 nervous systems in the same body, all will be interesting during retrofits. Fire compliance. Being able to demonstrate that the fire systems will work and will remove smoke from the building if you have a fire event on the occupied floors whilst you're doing all these changes. And even things like the building works as such, if you've got building works happening at the same time. You know, there's lots of folkloric stories about, well, the glass that we actually installed wasn't the glass that was designed, so therefore it hasn't got the same quality, so therefore the air conditioning system won't work because there's more heat coming in than what the air conditioning system was designed to accommodate. A whole range of things, hazardous materials. Dust is a really interesting one. You've got somebody working up on level 12 and there's a whole lot of plasterboard coming out and somehow the dust gets back into the air conditioning system and clogs up the filters. Or it doesn't clog up the filters and goes through to level 35. And all of a sudden people come in the next morning and there's a nice layer of white dust all over their desk. Not happy. And access management is a major thing. So there's lots of technical related issues when you come to doing retrofits. Not to make it seem too hard, because it's not. It's just about being planful and having the right people in the right place, doing the right things, aware of these things. Jumping out again, I mentioned last week this issue of BIM and digitisation of the built environment. It's the biggest thing that's happening in the construction industry in this country. The construction industry worldwide is the last great industry to digitise. The airline or the aerospace industry did it 30 years ago. The car industry did it 20 years ago. It's pushing through the construction industry. It'll push into the property and facilities management industry. There's not a major building being designed and constructed in Australia today that's not being driven out of a digital model as opposed to a set of CAD drawings. So it's a database as such, and as such it can be multi-dimensional, it can have anything in it. And so in a construction and a design sense, it's about obviously system performance, system design, buildability, supply chain, dollars, time, 5 or 6 different dimensions around design and installation. There's a whole range of things that's just absolutely radically transforming the Australian construction industry at the moment. It will push into the FM space. There's already a lot of talk about BIM and FM. How it evolves will be a very interesting thing. But if you think about everything that you've got on a database in your buildings, everything you've got on an Excel spreadsheet, everything that changes every day, all the information flows that come in and come out, theoretically that could all be in one interrelated database, related back to the built environment. So all the dynamic things that you deal with every day could be sitting back in a model that relates back to the model. So this is a take out of a model just to illustrate that every bit of kit, and that's a bit of duct, can have a whole lot of data associated with it. It's not just a bit of galvanised steel. There's a whole lot of things, what it connects to, how much air goes through it, how much it weighs, how much it costs, where it's made, all the different issues. If you take that back to a more complex piece of plant like a chiller or an air handling unit, again, all the maintenance requirements, all the compliance requirements, all the access issues, all the safety issues, cost issues, a whole range of different things, all linked back to a multi-dimensional database. You effectively have a virtual system. So back to refurbishment. We talked before about delivery options. So who do you need in your team? Who should you talk to first? All those sorts of things. It starts with objectives. That turns into scope. That turns into the skills that are needed. So whether it be project management, quantity surveying, building design, down to contractors and suppliers and specialists, it comes from what you're trying to achieve in the building. What is really, really important though is that if you've got any role in appointing people or contacting people, see what experience they've had. Experience in greenfield sites and new construction doesn't necessarily translate to brownfield sites and existing buildings. They're different beasts. How the industry throws concrete up and throws duct in and builds plant rooms on a greenfield site is quite different to how it might do that in your lounge room. For all the reasons I set out before in terms of operating buildings and what have you, there's a whole range of skills and awarenesses that come through experience that you don't read in a book. So experience in similar projects is really important. I mentioned quickly before this concept of energy performance contracts. Some of you might be aware of what they are. That's effectively a guaranteed performance outcome, time, cost, quality and performance. Can also bring funding to the process. So quite a few building upgrades, certainly overseas, and there are some in Australia that are actually done in that framework. So again, deals with some of these issues around veracity in terms of, okay, well, you've told me that if I do this and I do this and I do this, I should get this, this and this. How do I believe all that? And the contractor, the energy performance contractor says, well, trust us, because at the end of the day, if you don't make those energy savings, we'll be giving you money back. So you've got that sort of option as well. And some of these things are tied into funding, and I'm sure they'll be talked about next week as well. So bearing in mind most of these things usually happen in occupied buildings, project management is clearly the key in all of this. Time, cost, quality and performance, especially if you're driving energy outcomes. Maintaining the tenant services, lease conditions, all those sorts of things are pretty important along the way. The stakeholders we talked about, maintaining compliance we've talked about, getting in and out of the building. That concept of stage completion, I think that actually rocks a few people when they realise that it's not going to just all finish one day. It'll actually be a number of different stages all the way through. And I can't stress this concept of that sort of communication skills. That relates to the types of people that you employ. If they're used to working in existing buildings, they'll understand the need to communicate. You don't have to communicate with the whole lot of stakeholders when you're actually working on a greenfield site. It all just goes up. It's all about between the trades. There's no tenants. There's no facilities managers. There's no real public issues and what have you.